Shalom. Welcome to Lights of the Nations. We are resuming our study of Maimonides, the Rambam, Hilchot Beit Habechira, Laws of the Chosen House, and having concluded the second chapter, which dealt with the details of the altar and its ramp, now beginning Perek Gimel, the third chapter of Beit Habechira. Now you'll recall that earlier on, the Rambam taught us in actually the first chapter of Hilchot Beit Habechira, he taught us that there were, according to his count, 7 major central vessels in the Holy Temple. In the previous chapter, as we've mentioned, chapter 2, the Rambam dealt with the concepts of the altar and its ramp. And now, in chapter 3, the Rambam is going to focus on the structure and the details of the remaining 5 major vessels, that is to say, the menorah and its accompanying vessels, the table of the showbread, the golden incense altar, and the copper wash basin. So the first vessel which we are going to encounter in the first halakha of chapter 3 is, in fact, the menorah. And the menorah, in many ways, is considered by many to be the most important vessel in the temple, the central symbol of the Holy Temple, precisely because the light of the menorah, which shines into the whole world through the Holy Temple, is reminiscent of, stands for, really, is a symbol of the light of the divine presence. Famous teaching of our sages, which is derived from a verse in the book of Kings, relating to the structure of the first temple, teaches us that the windows in the building of the sanctuary were very unique. The windows in the temple were constructed in such a way that the light coming from within the holy part of the temple, within the Kodesh, was diffused and was able to shine out to the world. In other words, normally we think of the purpose of a window to allow the light from outside, from the street, to come into the room to illuminate the building. But the description of the windows in the sanctuary was that they were actually narrow on the inside and wide on the outside, because their purpose was to allow the light emanating from within the temple, that is to say, the light of the divine presence, to go and shine forth into the world. And obviously, every detail of the temple, especially the major vessels, has layer upon layer of level of meaning and significance and interpretation. Suffice it to say that this is certainly a major theme of the menorah, the presence of the Shekhinah in the Holy Temple. The menorah, in many ways, is a mystery. It's difficult to comprehend, and in fact, our sages tell us specifically regarding Moshe Rabbeinu, regarding Moses, that when God commanded him concerning the menorah, he had a very difficult time indeed succeeding to comprehend, to understand what it was that God was telling him. And the Midrash tells us that ultimately the menorah, an image, a celestial picture, diagram of the menorah, is one of the things that God had to show Moses in order for him to comprehend the nature of the command. If it would not have been for the fact that God actually showed Moses a divine image, a heavenly picture of the menorah, he would not have been able to understand how to construct it. Before we begin Maimonides, let's look in the Torah itself for a moment. Let's look in Parshat Truma, the biblical section of Truma, that is 25th chapter of the book of Exodus, and we shall look at the actual verses relating to the construction of the menorah, actually beginning in Exodus 25, verse 31, Va'asita menorat zahav tahor, mikshat te'asa menorah, yirecha v'kana gviyeha kaftoreha ufarcheha mimena yiyu. We'll just read some of these verses in English. I'm not going to read this translation that I picked up, and thou shalt make a candlestick, and you shall make a menorah of pure gold. Of beaten work shall the menorah be made, its shaft and its branches, its bowls, its bulbs, and its flowers shall be of the same. And these words, bowls, bulbs, and flowers, its gvi'im, its kaftorim, and its prachim, these are very, very important details, as we'll see, regarding the construction of the menorah. And 6 branches shall come out of its sides, 3 branches of the menorah out of one side, and 3 branches of the menorah out of the other side, 3 cups made like almonds, with a bulb and a flower in one branch, and 3 cups made like almonds in the other branch, with a bulb and a flower. So in the 6 branches that come out of the menorah. So in the 6 branches that come out of the menorah. And in the menorah shall be 4 bowls made like almonds, with their bulbs and flowers. And there shall be a bulb under 2 branches of the same piece, and a bulb under 2 branches of the same piece, and a bulb under 2 branches of the same piece, according to the 6 branches that proceed out of the candlestick, out of the menorah. Their bulbs and their branches shall be made of the same piece. All shall be one beaten work of pure gold, and you shall make its 7 lamps, and they shall light its lamps, that they may give light over against it. And these basically are the main verses in the Torah that describe the construction of the menorah. Now, before we begin reading the words of Maimonides and delving into the explanation that he gives of this intricate biblical commandment, this would be the time to mention that, as many of you know, there is quite a raging controversy regarding the exact shape of the menorah as it was present in the Holy Temple. And I don't really feel that this would be the place and the time to decide upon this for all time, for all of history. There are many, many different opinions that have been put forth regarding this issue. And to summarize this kind of as basically as we can, the 2 alternatives that are put forth by our sages, since the Torah itself does not really seem to indicate the exact shape of the structure and its branches, the 2 alternatives that are put forth are either a menorah of straight branches, rather angular, or a menorah of round branches. Maimonides himself has a sketch, which is either in his own hand or in the hand of his son, that appears in his commentary to the Mishnah. And that diagram that Maimonides actually refers to in his commentary certainly portrays a menorah of the angular version, of the straight branches. This might indicate to some that Maimonides is telling us, as a matter of course, that the menorah, in his opinion, was straight, angular. However, he doesn't really seem to indicate that in his words. In the words that he uses, he seems to, and I'm jumping ahead here, really, but this is such an important issue that I think we should try to clarify to some degree before we actually begin discussing the intricacies of the menorah. He seems to be indicating in that place, in his words, that all he's attempting to do through that diagram is to provide kind of a schematic map of the location on the branches of the ornamentation of these bowls and cups and flowers, telling us exactly where they are to sit on the branches, but not necessarily telling us and rendering a matter of biblical law that it has to be straight. This is what some would opine, that this is the purpose of that diagram. Now the other alternative, the round menorah, as is well known, is actually featured on the historical Arch of Titus, which, of course, is a monument that was erected by the Romans who destroyed the Second Temple, who captured and exiled Judea, exiled the Jewish people, and we read in many ancient chronicles how the Romans had a forced victory parade where the Jews were taken captive, actually bearing the treasures of the temple out of Zion and Jerusalem and into exile, and that was portrayed on the Arch of Titus, that victory arch in Rome, which can be seen to this day. And that monument features an image of the Jews carrying plundered temple vessels, and at the head of the procession we see the menorah, and that menorah is round. Now, I don't intend by telling you this to imply that the menorah pictured on the Arch of Titus, or indeed the Arch of Titus at all, should be viewed in any way as a halachic source, as a source from whence we can derive details pertaining to our sacred menorah that stood in the temple. That is not my intention in citing the Arch of Titus. Obviously, as a historical fact, as evidence to the Roman destruction of the temple, and apparently as evidence to the elusive historical fact that the vessels from the temple were in fact taken to Rome, there can be little doubt that in that context, the Arch of Titus is indeed authentic and important. However, much research and many, many pages have been written by great luminaries of Israel throughout the ages regarding the menorah and the image of the menorah that is depicted on the Arch of Titus. So that all of the rabbis would basically admit that we cannot derive halachic significance from the image of the menorah on the Arch of Titus for any number of reasons. You can tell if you look at the menorah on the Arch of Titus proportionally that its size is way off, because we know that the Torah's requirement of the menorah is that it be 18 handbreadths high, which is the height of an average man. And that certainly is much smaller, the one that we see on the Arch of Titus. So too, on the base of the menorah of the Arch of Titus, we can see the images of dragons. And there were certainly no dragons portrayed in the house of the one God of Israel. And again, so much has been written, and so many great rabbis of the generations have speculated and have dealt with these issues, and some have pointed out, for example, that some have speculated that the menorah was actually taken from the temple, but that en route something happened to it and a different menorah was substituted. Some have speculated that the Jewish people themselves were successful at the last minute in sending a different decoy menorah out of the temple. All sorts of things have been written regarding these very strange details about the menorah on the Arch of Titus. And again, it isn't my intention to necessarily learn from, to derive details that are halachically Torah binding from that image, but it is something that we do need to deal with. And there are also opinions, for example, that it's forbidden, some say it's forbidden to say that the menorah in the temple was round, because you can't derive that from the Arch of Titus, because how could you learn such a thing from the pagan Romans, and that the fact that it's round is a proof, some rabbis want to say, that the fact that it's round on the Arch of Titus is a proof that it was really angular because they were mocking the Jews. All sorts of different speculations and different kind of theories about how to deal with the historical monuments that we see in Rome. So the first thing that I must point out that's incredibly important for us to understand at this point of our study is that halachically, in other words, as far as the requirements of Torah law are concerned, either shape is perfectly kosher. You should know that another difficulty that the angular people, the straight menorah camp, Another difficulty that they have, and that they have to deal with, is the fact that in addition to the Arch of Titus, aside from the Arch of Titus, there are other ancient historical depictions that are far more authentic to the Jewish people, other ancient historical depictions of a round menorah, including eyewitness descriptions of the menorah from the time of the temple. And these descriptions seem to indicate a round menorah. Here in Jerusalem, at an important archaeological excavation known as the Herodian Quarter, the Old City of Jerusalem, homes that are known to have belonged to the high priesthood at the time of the Second Temple, a beautiful mosaic was uncovered that features a round menorah. There is also the eyewitness description of Flavius Josephus, Yosef ben Mattatyahu, who himself served as a Kohen, as a priest, in the Holy Temple, who describes a round menorah. And admittedly, it's well known that not everything that Josephus writes can be taken literally, but that has to do with certain statements that he makes, self-aggrandizing statements that he makes about himself and his role, and a certain kind of rewriting of some facts that he found it necessary to doctor in order to cover himself. He was a very problematic personality, as you may be aware. But as far as the historicity and the aspect of testimony of the things that he writes, it's well known and well accepted amongst all the scholars that his writings, the writings of Josephus, are absolutely invaluable in terms of shedding light on everyday life in the time of the temple. So keeping that in mind, here we have some sort of testimony to seeing a round menorah in the temple. So I'm not going to actually solve this dilemma at the moment. We're not going to render a decision about what was in the time of the temple in any event. There are many good reasons and valid reasons based on the writings of the Rambam and others, many valid reasons to believe that the menorah in the time of the temple was angular. There are just as many valid and important historical and Torah-based reasons to believe that the menorah in the time of the Holy Temple was of a rounded nature. Many rabbinical authorities also indicate that. But the important thing for us to understand at this point is that truly, according to our understanding of all of the authorities, this concept, the concept of the exact shape of the branches, is not an impediment to the kashrut, to the validity of the menorah. And perhaps we will be able to figure out at one point exactly how it was, perhaps not at this point. Also, on a mystical level, Kabbalistically, there are different ways of looking at the two schemes, the two formulas, and that is also a whole other world of understanding as to why we might think that it goes one way or another. But the main thing that we have to know is that the details pertaining to the menorah that we're going to be learning about in the next few halachot, the ornamentation of the menorah, what we're referring to as the bowls, the cups and the knobs and the flowers, the almond shapes, these things are intrinsically imperative to the kashrut, to the validity of a golden menorah. And as many of our viewers are certainly aware, the Temple Institute, in fact, has constructed a menorah, which we believe, according to the sources of Jewish law, can be used at this point in the Holy Temple. Doesn't mean that a better menorah, or that a menorah which perhaps satisfies different degrees of other opinions, cannot be built, but as far as the priorities of life and knowing that we have done already as much as we can and that we have something to begin the divine service with, we have fulfilled that point with the menorah that we currently possess. So we're going to begin our study of the menorah, the source of the divine light in the Holy Temple. And the Rambam begins in Halacha Aleph, in the first halacha of chapter 3, HaMenorah Miforeshet Tzurata Batorah. the form, the composition of the menorah, Maimonides states, is explained in the Torah. And these are his opening words. He refers, of course, to the verses which we read at the beginning of this segment, the verses that appear in Parshat Truma, in Exodus chapter 25. And it's actually quite interesting that the first thing that the Rambam has to say about the menorah, as opposed to many other things that we have studied about and that we're going to study about, the Rambam says, well, the menorah is explained in the Torah. And then he goes on to tell us, V'arba gvi'im, u'shnei kafturim, u'shnei prachim, hayu b'knei hamenorah, shene'amar, u'bamenorah, arba gvi'im, shukadim, kaftoreh, u'farcheha. And then he begins, and he says that there are 4 bowls or cups, and 2 knobs or buttons, they can be called, and 2 flowers in the branch, the main stem of the menorah, as the verse states. And he quotes chapter 35, verse 34, that says, and in the menorah shall be 4 bowls made like almonds, with their bulbs and flowers. So, the first point of real interest that I would like to make is the fact that the Rambam goes and tells us everything I'm about to explain to you. He says, everything we're about to discuss, it's all explained in the Torah. And of course, if that is the case, and it is the case, why does he now go into a very, very detailed explanation and analysis of what these words mean? Well, as you will see, and as you probably already have guessed, the structure, the form, the image, the details of the menorah are actually the most complicated, the most complex and multifaceted vessel in the temple. This perhaps is an aspect of the statement that our sages make, as we mentioned earlier, that Moshe himself, Moses, when he received the commandment from the Almighty, when he was told by God to create the menorah, he actually had a very hard time understanding what was meant, and ultimately the Holy One, blessed be He, showed him an image of the menorah. Commenting on this homiletical teaching, the Ramban, Nachmanides, tells us that the wisdom, and these are his words, the words of Nachmanides, the Ramban, he says, the wisdom of the menorah, as far as its bowls and its knobs and its flowers, is extremely elusive. Another commentary, for example, the Chizkuni, as opposed to Nachmanides, explains that the difficulty that Moses had was actually simply in reference to its height, because its height is not clearly defined. And thus, the Rambam here simply emphasizes the fact that, after all, the form of the menorah is explained in the Torah. One thing is for certain. Whatever idea the Medrash is putting forward by telling us that Moses, our master, the great teacher of the Jewish people, telling us that he had a difficulty in comprehending the concept of the menorah, whatever idea is being expressed there, we know that ultimately Moses did overcome that handicap, and that more importantly, throughout history, the building of the menorah became something that was readily understood. So that to some extent its mystery, or if it, as the Ramban, Nachmanides tells us, its extremely highly elusive nature was somehow overcome. And specifically, I'm thinking about the fact that King Solomon, we are told in the Book of Kings, actually constructed an additional 10 menorahs, so that the sanctuary, in the time of the first temple, under the direction of King Solomon, actually featured 11 menorahs. The original, that of the commandment, and another 10, for the reasons that King Solomon had, which is another story altogether. He had the 11 candelabras, the 11 menorahs, and also 11 tables of the showbread, and the one golden incense altar. So obviously my point is that King Solomon somehow mastered the elusive science of creating the menorah and really got it down to a science and was able to accomplish this. So perhaps the allegorical statement that our sages make that Moses did not understand how to create the menorah, perhaps this is something which is only the reflection of the mystical essence of the menorah. Perhaps it refers to the actual physical execution of the project. That's another question altogether. But one thing is certain, and that is as we're going to delve further into this chapter and see the details laid down to us by the great Maimonides, referring to the exact details of how to construct the menorah, we understand that general principle which serves as our guide throughout, that the concepts, the commandments of the Torah are eternal. They're given to us to fulfill. So too today in the Temple Institute we have tried to fulfill the concept of the menorah to the best of our abilities. The menorah is the symbol of the light of the divine presence, and as we'll see, according to the guidelines of Maimonides, the menorah can be constructed today. The whole purpose of the Holy Temple, the concept of the menorah, the light of the divine presence that will return to the world, the light to Israel, and the light to the nations.